It is now about 12 minutes after 5 in the morning on the 15th of September. And about 6:30, I'm going to be heading out to the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. I've got some things to look up, which I'll go into in a minute. Um, First, I wanted to mention that people are continuing to look at my papers on Academia EDU. And this one in particular, of course, I can't show the name, is crossing subjects, which is what I want to see, because they're not only looking at my historical literary discoveries, but they're also reading about my reincarnation case. And this is what I want, is to bring reincarnation into this evolving controversy. So you see here that the person has read and either saved or downloaded, first of all, Defeating the Cryptomnesia Objection. That's my paper about my case and how I researched it. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning's plagiarism of Matthew's work. I just revised that because I found out that The Cry of the Children was probably written by Matthew and not by Abby, as I had earlier felt, although they could have collaborated on something like it earlier. That's a long story I won't get into right now. Then a relatively brief biographical sketch of Matthew that I wrote fairly recently. So that's interest in Matthew's life. Who was he? And then Margaret Fuller's dishonest appropriation of Matthew's star signature. So we have somebody looking into two of the historical literary claims, Matthew's personal biography, and my reincarnation case. This is hopefully the wave of the future. Now, I also wanted to mention that the entry before last for August 30th has only seen 7 views, and that's a crucial one. Now, each one of these entries, I'm presenting some piece of the puzzle, okay? I'm building a case, and I'm presenting certain evidence. And this is a crucial piece of evidence that Matthew Franklin Whittier was fully aware that he was a genius, a literary genius from childhood. And of course, one doesn't come right out and say such things, which is maybe why people are so offended that they won't look at the video. But he was saying it through his humorous characters, and he's joking, but he's actually serious. And it's important because if I am to claim that I have proven that Matthew was the real author of certain literary classics, then he had to have been a literary genius. And one piece of the puzzle is that he knew and said that he knew that he was a literary genius. Okay, so I don't know why people don't want to watch that. Maybe they're tired of the Cayenne Pepper series, or maybe they just think it's horrifically immodest, for me to present that. But it's a crucial piece of evidence. So I suggest people go back and look at that. Now, one of the things I'm going to be looking for today at the Antiquarian Society, which I call the Ant Society, just for jokes, is the precursor to one of Matthew's stories. The second version appeared, let's see, I don't have the date, but it's, I think it's January of 1832. I can put it up here on the screen. And he signed it D. Now, that was Matthew's go-to signature when he was editing the New York Constellation in 1830, 31, 32. It was not Asa Green, the editor-in-chief, because Asa Green had turned over the editorial duties to Matthew, near as I can tell, probably while Asa Green ran his bookstore. So all of the material in the Constellation that people attribute to Green was really actually Matthew Franklin Whittier. Well, this was no exception. And I recognized that this story, No Ear for Music, was actually a veiled story about Albert Pike. Now, Albert Pike was a sociopath, in my estimation, a plagiarist, and he plagiarized Abby's poetry when she was 14 years old and attending his class in Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1830. So he also adulterated some of it, but you can find the portions, that are hers and the poems that are entirely hers. And this is something I want to set straight for posterity. So about Albert Pike, he went on, although he was born in Massachusetts, he went on to fight as a general for the South in the Civil War. He went on to be a 33-degree Mason, the top-level Mason. He's been charged with teaching Luciferianism. He's also been implicated in a number of conspiracies concerning, as I understand, trying to bring back the South, possibly the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And here's just something that somebody named Tex Mars wrote about him online. Albert Pike was a Confederate war general. During the conflict, Pike was accused of using native Choctaw Indian warriors to take the scalps of slain Yankee soldiers. And this is all according to Tex Mars. I haven't fact-checked this. He would feast his soldiers and the Indians with wagons filled with body whores and ply them with liquor. I don't know if that's true or not. President Abraham Lincoln declared rebel Pike a criminal menace and sought to capture and imprison the corrupt general. When the war ended, Pike immediately fled to the safety of neighboring Canada. Some believe that Albert Pike was involved in the conspiracy and plot to murder Lincoln, and then he goes on to say that Pike was a founder of the Ku Klux Klan. So that's the character that you're dealing with, who I say, and I can prove, plagiarized Abby Poyen's poetry when she was 14 and got famous off it. There's no way that this scoundrel wrote that beautiful, sensitive, mystical poetry. It's a total impossibility. It's oxymoronic, just like it's impossible that Charles Dickens could have written A Christmas Carol and so on. Charles Dickens wasn't a much better character than Pike, actually, and Poe is in a league of his own. So these supposedly outrageous claims I'm making make perfect sense, okay, because these people could not possibly have written these works. This is what Matthew, signing as D, says in his introduction to the story No Ear for Music. It says the following story was originally published in the New England Galaxy some 6 or 7 years since, and is now, after the manner of certain articles in a contemporary hebdomadal, republished in this paper, with such amendments as suggested themselves to the author in the reperusal of an early production, signed D, and then the story is also signed D. Then he comes back in the February 4, 1832 edition and responds as though he's one of the readers, signing Franklin. So Matthew has made it abundantly clear that he wrote this story and that he had written the one in the New England Galaxy some 6 or 7 years earlier. And I have established that Matthew wrote for the New England Galaxy. He started when he ran away from home as a boy of 12 in 1825. But since this says 6 or 7 years earlier, I'm going to be getting into the 1824 and 1825 volumes for the New England Galaxy. Today, I want to try to find this precursor work. What I'm expecting to find is that when Matthew rewrote it or modified it in 1832, he specifically added the references to Albert Pike, that he took a story that was about tone deafness that he wrote years earlier and reworked it so as specifically to be a veiled reference to Albert Pike, and specifically how he got into trouble and fled Massachusetts and ended up in Arkansas. Because Albert Pike's lie about this is that he'd fallen in love with a girl named Elizabeth Perkins, who was in the family that he was boarding with when he was a teacher, and that he wanted to ask her to marry him, but he was too poor to ask her to marry him. And so in shame and to forget her, he, left, right? Well, no, I think it was he was threatened with a shotgun wedding and bugged out. I'm pretty sure that's what Matthew indicates in so many words, that he got involved with her and was humiliated, see? So I want to find this early paper. I want to see what it's signed as. One of Matthew's go-to signatures in the New England Galaxy was NNK, which I suspect was probably for Never Never Know, meaning that it was a deeply anonymous signature. If the precursor to No Ear with Music is signed NNK, then I've got him, okay? And this works both ways. So not only do I have evidence verifying Matthew's early writing for the New England Galaxy, but I also have his authorship as D in the later New York Constellation, and there's a whole bunch of stories written as D, which comprise their own evidence, see? And it also shows that this was indeed Matthew Franklin Whittier surreptitiously telling us why Albert Pike left Massachusetts. Now, Matthew would have been in a position to know him because they grew up not too far away from each other. Matthew was in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and Pike grew up in Newburyport nearby. Matthew certainly would have known of Pike through Abby. I believe it was Matthew who is quoted anonymously as saying that Pike was a great plagiarist. That was supposedly said by a New York literary man. That's one of Pike's biographers. Matthew was a longtime New York literary man. I'm pretty sure that was his quote. So we're going to tie all this together today with any luck, and I will come back and announce my results. I successfully completed my trip to the American Antiquarian Society last Wednesday. This is Saturday, and I got some pretty incredible results, which I'm going to share. It's rather complex. I'm going to have to go by my notes. So first, to reiterate, I had two goals. And the first was to get into the New England Galaxy of, say, 1824, 1825, and look for a piece that Matthew had referred to when he wrote, was it 1831, I believe it was, or 1832, about what I believed was Albert Pike, a veiled reference to Albert Pike. And I've talked about that before. We'll get into that again a little bit. And I did indeed find that and a few other things as well. And then the second one was to get into the Portland Transcript of 1839, which I had only seen the first part of. I wanted to see the last portion of 1839. These volumes go from spring to spring, and I hadn't seen the rest of 1839. The history of that is that Matthew and Abby moved to Portland, Maine in late 1838. It was an arrangement made by Matthew's brother to work for a Quaker there who owned a stove business. And a couple months into it, Matthew had to buy the business out with a partner. And he once again picked an unfortunate partner because he didn't have the money himself. So he had to partner with somebody who had the money. He'd always done that and always run into big trouble doing that. He felt that he didn't have any choice. The economy was bad. They were still suffering from the Panic of 1837, which had to do with Andrew Jackson and how he changed the banking system. And it was an ill-advised move because they're in the middle of a recession or a depression, and this is a stove business. You can't sell big-ticket items, at least enough of them to make a living, in a bad economy. And Matthew was too soft-hearted. I think that he would actually discourage poor families from buying a stove during a depression, when they needed the money for other things. I was the same way with my little video business years ago. So anyway, that's kind of the context. Abby came down with tuberculosis, which she'd probably contracted some years earlier, but the symptoms started coming out towards the end of 1839. Matthew's business was failing. Apparently, he started drinking because his partner, an Irishman, was a drinker and kind of tempted Matthew into drinking. And that got pretty serious. And the relationship was under all kinds of stress, some of which I won't go into probably. But it darn near fell apart. And at some point, Abby went, I think, to Guadeloupe, which is where her father was from. And I think she was tended by Charles Poyen, the mesmerist, the man that introduced hypnotism to America. That was her first cousin, and I think he treated her there in Guadeloupe. But she was pregnant, and she came back and gave birth to their second child, Sarah, in July of 1840. And things kind of went along pretty well, but then her symptoms of consumption or tuberculosis came back. And she got sicker and sicker, and the business was going down, and they were forced to live in a hotel that was run by distant relatives. And eventually, about a week before she died, she was taken back to her father's house. Now, whether she conceived of that as leaving Matthew or not, I don't know. I've always felt that he insisted that she go because he was trying to save her life. And it was kind of a humiliation for him because her father had always said he wouldn't help her unless she left Matthew. They had eloped. I extrapolated that from a great many clues. I'd always felt it. And in particular, this detail that he'd said he would not help them unless she left Matthew. I just felt that. Well, now we have proof for that, or evidence for that. And I have to preface all this by saying that Matthew and Abby, as writers, both knew that you had to try to write from real life, at least to some extent. Matthew took that more literally than Abby did. He would literally write real life and kind of cast a little bit of obfuscation over it so you couldn't tell who it was. But basically, Matthew wrote autobiography, whereas Abby would more traditionally write fiction, but then she would draw from her life. So with Matthew, you can pretty much extrapolate his own personal life from his fiction. With Abby, it's not so simple, but you can get a sense of what she was dealing with and what her life was like, but you can't make a direct point-for-point comparison or parallel between her fiction and her actual life. That's going to be important as we go on. Okay, so with that preface, let's go to the New England Galaxy. And I'm going to have to go strictly from my notes here because it's just so complicated. First of all, I have said that I was convinced that Matthew wrote a humorous series of letters from a country bumpkin who had gone to the big city. His name was Joe Strickland, and I presented him before. This would be the very first time that this kind of Yankee dialect with horrible spelling was used in literature in America. Matthew was the originator of this genre, near as I can tell. And he was, once again, he was actually, this was him. Joe Strickland was him, but countrified and made into an ignorant, brash character in the big city, you know. But basically, it was his situation. He was 12 years old. He'd run away from home. He'd gone to Boston and New York City. He was writing for 3 different editors. And Joe Strickland was himself. Well, I have some evidence that that was the case. Throughout Matthew's career, he would occasionally write these letters to the editor that were in more or less the same style. You know, not quite as thick, because Joe Strickland was like every single word was misspelled. Everything was a malapropism. In other words, he threw everything but the kitchen sink into these letters, and they were very hard to read because it was almost like reading what they used to call phonotype, which was phonetic spelling. Well, later on in life, he backed off that a little bit to where maybe every 5th word was misspelled, or, you know, the grammar or the punctuation was wrong, but it wasn't so difficult to read. Well, I thought that he had developed that style later on to kind of back off from Joe Strickland, but no. Roughly a month after the first Joe Strickland letter appears in the New York National Advocate, which he was writing for, those two came on July 15 and July 22. Well, his birthday is July 18, so that like spans right about the time of his birthday. So that was 1825, so that was like 12 and 13 years old. So on August 12, 1825, in the New England Galaxy, which Matthew was also writing for, is an introduction to a letter signed W. So in other words, if we want to assign this to anybody else besides Matthew, they have to have the initial W. Okay, so basically this is 100% proven for Matthew Franklin Whittier. And this, he's just turned 13 here. So he has supposedly found a love letter, and he leaves it up to the editor whether or not it should be printed, see? So let's see if I wrote that out where I can read some of it to you. I did not. But what I'm going to do is just put it up on the screen, and you can kind of get a sense of it there. Unfortunately, I didn't print that one out, and I'm not going to go back. But the gist of it is that it proves that Matthew was writing in this style before anybody else was, as near as I can tell, only a month after the Joe Strickland letters commenced. So Matthew was Joe Strickland. Matthew was writing for the New York National Advocate and the New England Galaxy at age 12 and 13. See? So this is now proven. At least to my satisfaction anyway. Skeptics are never satisfied with anything, so it's kind of irrelevant. whether they're satisfied or not. Once you see that a skeptic is actually a cynic and that they're never ever going to be satisfied by anything and that they're always going to raise the bar because they're in denial, I discount them. They're no longer valid contenders in the debate. They've disqualified themselves by that kind of behavior. And in any formal debate, I think you would disqualify yourself. It's just like in a chess match, if you were caught cheating, that's it, you're out. You don't get to compete anymore. See, but here in this materialistic society, if a cynic who's indulging in sophistry and dishonest, means in his arguments, he's allowed to just continue if he does that. There's no referee, there's no society to tell him, no, you are not considered a viable contender anymore. They just go on and they get more lauds and honors and more credibility and everything, see? So the problem is society that actually gives these people credibility to where they can continue in that vein. Anyway, so much for my editorial. Now, I did in fact find no ear for music. So let me go over the history of that. First of all, in the New York Constellation, when Matthew was editing this newspaper for the editor-in-chief and owner, Asa Green, as I have determined, he signed D. He either wrote with no signature at all or he wrote with the signature D. And this is something I've concluded by many pieces of evidence, but now we basically got the proof for it. So in the January 22nd, 1831 edition, Matthew writes a story about Jonathan Jenks. And this is a veiled reference, I believe, to Albert Pike, who right about this time was getting ready to leave Massachusetts. And the question is, why did he leave Massachusetts? Well, what he told Rufus Griswold, his biographer, and the fellow that compiled poetry, this is also the fellow that figures in Edgar Allan Poe, but that's another story. So what he told him was that he fell in love with a girl named Elizabeth Perkins, who, as I recall from another source, was a girl in the household, in the house that was putting him up while he was a country teacher. See, he stayed at their house. Well, he fell in love with this girl, but according to him, he was too poor to ask her to marry. He was too embarrassed to ask her to marry him. So in his angst, he left town, see, and literally footed it, eventually ending up in Arkansas. So, but what apparently happened, based on Matthew's story of Jonathan Jenks, which features a girl named Bouncing Betsy that he ends up taking to the dance and humiliating himself with. Well, Elizabeth Perkins and Bouncing Betsy are almost for sure the same person. And this was before Albert Pike actually left town. So apparently word had gotten around that he had gotten involved with Bouncing Betsy, and they were expected to marry, like a shotgun wedding. This is what I extrapolate. But come spring, as soon as the weather was, thawed out enough for him to travel, he took off. That's what really happened. Well, that's what this story about Jonathan Jenks is really about. But then a year later, roughly, on January 21st, 1832, almost exactly a year later, he brought back this story, No Ear for Music. And I found it. The original was in the New England Galaxy, as D says it was, published in the August 26th, 1825 edition. Now, I thought to myself, well, this is way before Albert Pike would have been teaching, I would think. Albert Pike was 15 years old at this time, going on 16. And so, he couldn't have gotten involved with Elizabeth Perkins at this time. So I thought, I've screwed up. I've assumed that was about Albert Pike, because what I expected to happen was that I would find the original and none of the references, veiled references to Albert Pike would be there. I thought all of that would have been added later on in 1832. Well, I was wrong. The original is almost verbatim the same as the one that Matthew republished in 1832, with minor editorial and grammatical changes. There's a lot less dashes and more commas and semicolons, and there's a couple little things have been changed. There is one change, and that is that the opening quote was longer. And by gosh, I didn't write that down either here in my notes. But it comes from The Merchant of Venice and Shakespeare. And whereas the story is supposed to be about a tone-deaf man, the quote clearly references somebody who is a sociopath, essentially. And what Matthew was telling us in the opening quote was, a tone-deaf man is just a metaphor. What I'm really talking about is somebody who's unscrupulous, who has no conscience, who has no heart that he taps into to regulate his, moral actions. See, so that was the subject. So now, could this have been about Albert Pike? Then I found something very interesting, and that is that now we know that Matthew wanted to go to college at age 12, and this was why he ran away from home. I'm extrapolating from some of his stories that he wanted to go to college. His father refused. His brother, who was 5 years older, was going to go to the Haverhill Academy, which had just recently opened in Haverhill, Massachusetts. But Matthew also wanted to go and was denied, see? So Matthew ran away from home and was going to strike out on his own and educate himself. Well, I think that he and Albert Pike were enemies. Pike was 2.5 years older. They were both about 6 feet tall, probably reached their height fairly early. But Pike was older. He was stouter. He was, supposed to be 300 pounds, probably as an adult. And he was a sociopath. And they lived in adjoining towns. Matthew was near Haverhill, Massachusetts, and Albert Pike was in Newburyport, Massachusetts. So they would have known each other as children growing up. And I think Matthew really disliked him. So Matthew, of course, desperately wanted to go to college. Well, the word got out in August 1825, the same month that this piece was published, that Albert Pike had been accepted to Harvard. So I think that Matthew wrote this story and published it in the New England Galaxy in response to the news that Albert Pike had been accepted to Harvard. It's too much of a coincidence that it came out in exactly the same month. So I think he was kind of looking forward to what kind of career Albert Pike would have as a teacher. And he knew that during the winter months that people going to college would teach country schools. So he just got that right, I'm guessing. This is extrapolation, but it's pretty tight. I'm pretty sure I'm right. So the first instance of No Ear for Music was in response to the news, because word spread fast, among the locals, that Albert Pike had been accepted to Harvard. Again, this is published toward the end of that month on the 26th. So there was ample time for Matthew to have gotten a word that Albert Pike had been accepted to Harvard. As it turns out, it's not totally clear, but apparently Pike didn't have the funds to go, and he decided to educate himself and teach school instead. Now, when he started teaching school, I don't know, but probably he had not started teaching school by the time that Matthew published this piece, that he was just kind of extrapolating out what his career would be like. So anyway, now that in 1832, by the time that Albert Pike had shown his true colors, had plagiarized Abbey's poems like crazy and modified them and published them under their shared initials AP, and had been shamed in Massachusetts and had literally run on foot out of town, probably to escape having to marry Elizabeth Perkins, and ended up in Arkansas, Matthew decided to bring back No Ear for Music. And he just modified it a little bit. And typically he was very honest about the fact that he had modified it a little, but he signs the introduction D and he signs the story D, whereas it was unsigned back in 1825. So when he says that the author has made these changes and then he signs both the introduction and the story D, he means that he wrote it back in 1825 for the New England Galaxy. It's airtight, this whole business. So that was pretty interesting. Now we move to the Portland Transcript of 1839. Now, first of all, there's two new poems. Matthew was definitely signing with his middle initial F. He would use different signatures in different papers at different times, but typically he would stick with one for at least a while. So he was signing as F in the Portland Transcript of 1838 and 1839. I have other examples. So I have two new poems. Now, both of these poems are written roughly, I say roughly for the scholars who are nitpicky about this, in the same style and tone as The Raven. Now, I had one from, I think it's 1843, 2 years before The Raven was published, called The Crucifixion, that kind of talks about how nature would respond to Christ's crucifixion. And that was the earliest one I had in this style. But these are also in the same style as The Crucifixion, and they go back to 1839. So we now have 3 examples of Matthew writing in roughly this style before he wrote The Raven, plus one that came out about 3 weeks or a month earlier in the New York Tribune, which he was writing for, signed M. So we actually have 4 of Matthew's poems roughly in this style before The Raven came out, and nothing by Poe in this style before The Raven came out, by the way. So let's see. The first of these is called The Storm at Sea, which is just what it sounds like. Again, I didn't print it out, but I've got a little snippet of it I can put on the screen for you to get an idea of it. And the second one is called Lines Written on Hearing Sweet Home, Played and Sung. And again, it's in the same style, and that's kind of an interesting one. Normally, Matthew would write from personal life, meaning from his own experience. But in this case, as near as I can tell, because it wouldn't fit for him, there's details in this that just wouldn't fit for him. Even if he was feeling estranged from Abby, which I don't think he was at this time, it just wouldn't be a match. What happened is that Abby, during this period, was doing charity work. She wasn't working, but she was doing a lot of charity work while Matthew was running the business. And one of the things apparently she did was to give a concert with harp and voice. Now, I long thought that she played harp because there's a reference to it in one of Matthew's tribute poems, but she was in heaven. It's called To a Bright Lady, was published in 1846. And I thought, well, maybe the reference to harp playing could just be because she's in heaven. See, well, no. Apparently she did, in fact, play the harp as well as the piano, and she gave a free concert for the down and outers, see, the vagabonds and so on. Well, she played Sweet Home, apparently, and some vagabond was so deeply affected by it that he asked her to stop, or obviously wished she would stop, one of the two, and Matthew wrote a poem about it in first person as this vagabond. Well, it's a beautiful poem, but now I have said that I determined from both inner and outer clues that this is one of the songbooks that Abby played from. Kingsley Social Circle, this is volume number 1. There's reason to believe that because when they lived in Dover, New Hampshire in 1837, this was in a list that I believe she compiled of books for sale, whether they were like her books that they were trying to sell or whether they were, just titles that she liked. I don't know. But anyway, I bought it on that basis and said, oh, this must be one of the ones that Abby had. And indeed, I found 2 or 3 or 4 songs that I definitely knew that she had played for Matthew. I could feel it very strongly, very articulate, past life memory. Smells and songs are 2 of the things that tap into the emotions most strongly for some reason. Past life memories can be triggered by either scents or songs quite easily. And I can't describe to you what I feel when I smell these old volumes, but there's definitely, a hit there. Well, anyway, Sweet Home is in this volume. It's back here. It's a duet. It's not long, but it's here. I believe you can see it. So that's one of 2. I'll show you the second one in a little bit. All these things tie together, and it's not miraculous at all if they tie together. It just means it's true. That's all. It just means that what I'm presenting is real. And therefore, all of these details are going to have a place, see, and they're all going to interconnect. This is what I mean by a tapestry. It's a tapestry because I'm not making it up. It's not a delusional system or a theory that isn't real. It's actually real, and that's why all these things tie together. So Sweet Home is in there. She apparently played it, and a vagabond just couldn't take it and said, stop. I don't have a home. I'm, whatever. So those were 2 really nice finds. Now, the other things I found are very difficult for me to talk about, especially the second one. These are 2 short stories, fairly substantial short stories, written by Abby, signed with a double asterisk or a double star. And they appear toward the end of 1839. Now, this is about the period where she realized she had consumption, where they were struggling with the business, the stove business, and they were in dire straits. I think that there was so much pressure on this marriage that it was falling apart, or it was in danger of cracking. There was jealousy issues, apparently. I think that they were being poisoned by lead in the pipes and in the cheap pewter and in the cheap wine that they had to use. So I think, that affects your mind also, lead poisoning. So it's hard to say what contributed to what, but they were breaking apart really personally in the marriage. Not to the point that it ever completely failed, I don't think. But the circumstances were that her father had always said, they'd eloped, and her father had always said, I will not help you unless you leave Matthew. There was a lot of enmity between the two, the father and the father-in-law and the son. And Abby came from an upper-class family. Her father was a marquis. She renounced the family money because it came from slavery from Guadeloupe, where there was a plantation. His family had left Guadeloupe in a slave uprising in the late 1700s. So at this point, I would guess she had people advising her, oh, he's a drunk. He'll, he's not tending to his business, and you should leave him. You should go back to your father, and your father will forgive you. Well, I don't think that she ever really would have done that, but I think it preyed on her mind, and she drew upon that apparently for the second story, which is very emotionally upsetting to me. I mean, I really struggled with it. Finally, I went back and looked at the character that would represent Matthew, and I said, no, he wasn't originally drawn to represent Matthew because he was himself raised with money. And he was spoiled, and he was lazy, and he didn't have a good work ethic. And that's why her parents said not to marry him, and that's why, ostensibly, why her father refused to help, see. But in real life, Matthew was very industrious, but he was honest. Like I said, he was too honest to sell stoves to poor people that couldn't afford it, and to lie or cheat in any other way. And he was trying to make the business successful, but he did have a weakness, and that was that he was too easily influenced by his friends and by alcohol, and he was a little bit immature. He tended to be cavalier, to put on a cavalier exterior and hide his feelings and look like nothing was bothering him. Well, we have a letter from this period that will give you an idea, because right at this time, Matthew wrote his sister Elizabeth. And let's see, I want to read just the relevant part. He talks a little bit about the bad economy. He sounds kind of flip. He always sounds this way, kind of humorous and making puns and everything. Even like 3 months after Abby died, he was doing that. That was just his external, bravado that he put on. So in the middle of the letter here, he says, Abby's health is not good by any means. Besides, she is very nervous. Then he says, business is very much used up in this city. Nearly all the larger houses have failed. I don't know how it will be, but hope it will be better soon. And he says his partner Hugh's health continues bad. So, I mean, the economy is so bad that nearly all the larger houses have failed, and he's trying to keep his business together. So it's not really his fault. It's not from neglect of the business. The drinking, I don't know. I don't know how serious it was. He beats himself up terribly in the future over this, as I'll show you. But how bad it really was, I don't know. It could be bad enough that there were rumors and that Abby's friends were advising her to leave Matthew, but it wasn't his fault about the business. And when he says that her health is bad and that she's very nervous, that's not the half of it. She may have kept from him just how upset and how worried she really was. She may have kept from him that she had the symptoms of tuberculosis and that she realized she had consumption and was dying. And that may have completely thrown her off, see, and made her feel utterly desperate. And all he knew was that she was very nervous, but he didn't know why. He may not have known that she had essentially received a death sentence. Maybe she'd coughed up blood or something and she was trying not to worry him. So that's that situation. And then as regards his drinking, I think he's kind of referring to it around the corner in this last paragraph. See what you think. As it regards my present situation, I feel that it is far better than I deserve, and that I cannot exhibit sufficient gratitude to God for this and the many, and Matthew was sincerely religious, he's not put on here, for this and the many other blessings that have been showered upon me and for which I have hitherto been ungrateful. She must have been preaching at him. Elizabeth, I do not feel that I am any better than, he might have been others, I'm not sure, ever. But through the mercy of divine grace, I trust I have been brought to see my dangerous situation in some small degree, and hope through the same means not only to see more of my heart, but to feel that repentance that needs not to be repented of. And he goes on about being a Christian and so on. Now, what is the dangerous situation? Is it his job? Is it his drinking? Is it his partner? Well, it was all a dangerous situation. So she may have tried to tell him, to warn him, and his response is kind of lukewarm, like, yeah, I got the message, So, what we're seeing here is my past life flaws, weaknesses, and Abby's also, her weaknesses. And it's very painful to look into a past life and to see, what one would need to learn. Well, Abby and I both have kind of overcome those weaknesses, or at least addressed them, I will say. But at this time, that wasn't the case. I'm sorry this is dragging on a bit. I have to be thorough, and I know there's not very many people interested in my work right now. Now there's one more person that looked at the entry that I created that has to do with Matthew knowing that he was a genius from childhood. This whole thing makes no sense if Matthew wasn't a genius. And that he knew he was and admitted it in a clownish sort of way is important. That's a significant piece of evidence. Because here's the thing, you may not believe that Matthew really wrote The Raven or Annabelle Lee, or that he and Abby really were co-authoring A Christmas Carol, which would have been about this time in 1838-39. But they did. And the only way they could have done that is if they were both child prodigies, which I've just proven that Matthew was writing sophisticated humor as a boy of 12. Okay, they were both child prodigies. They were both literary geniuses, and they would have had to be, in order for my conclusions to be correct, and they are correct. So for only 8 people to think that's interesting is a real problem. It suggests to me that people look at my information as entertainment while they're trying to shoot it down. They're interested in things that they can shoot down. They're not interested in the evidence that shows that I'm correct, see? That won't always be the case. Now, let's look at Abby's story. Her first one, which is called Phrenology versus Cupid, appears in 2 installments in the Portland Transcript of November 23 and November 30, 1825. The second one is signed with a double asterisk. Now, she might have meant one of 2 things with this. That could have been just her signature, AP, except with asterisks. I don't think so, because I've got lots of evidence that indicates that she thought of herself and Matthew as twin stars or twin souls, and that she loved the stars. She thought of them as being souls in heaven, and that 2 stars meant that they were twin stars or twin souls. So even though it looks as though she's tempted to leave Matthew and believes her father wasn't really such an ass as he actually was, when they eloped, there's a long story with that. Apparently, being a marquis, he just didn't want her to marry beneath her class, and he also wanted to marry her off to a wealthy suitor, which means, forgive my crassness, but essentially a man that does that is pimping his daughters. Okay, he's consigning them to sexual slavery so he can get money in return. Now, so this was not a nice guy, but of course Abby couldn't face that her father was really doing it for those motives. She imagined that he was just proud and that he really loved her and that they could reconcile. And she writes a tearful reconciliation for one of her characters, who then dies, see, which I'll go into, but she couldn't believe it. Now, Matthew knew it because in this book, The Rag Picker, Matthew very heavily relies on or draws upon that whole scenario for some of his characters. He reproduces that whole scenario with bells on, exaggerating it in that book. That's Matthew. That's autobiography in that book, where you have a husband and wife, and the husband's business, they elope, and the husband's business fails, and he drinks and becomes abusive and blah, blah, blah. And, eventually they reconcile. Eventually he reforms, and his wife stays faithful to him and survives, and they reconcile. See, in Matthew's story, the rag picker. So this goes to, am I just guessing that Matthew wrote the rag picker? No. It's obvious, okay? For many, many, many reasons, it's obvious. But anyway, in that story, Matthew has the father deliberately go behind his son-in-law's back and try to ruin his credit, to drive his creditors away from him. And if that's autobiographical, if that's what Abby's father, Joseph Poyen, did, probably when they first eloped to Dover, New Hampshire, and Matthew set up a business there, he was literally trying to destroy Matthew's business to make sure he didn't succeed, you see. So Abby didn't know that. Matthew didn't know that at the time either. And Abby never suspected that her father was that cruel to have actually tried to destroy his business, see. So I'm going to read you a little bit of that, and then we'll get into Abby's stories, because there's quite a bit that's, let's see. This is Annie and Henry, that stand for Matthew and Abby. Henry could not and did not lose sight of the fact that his fondly loved wife had made an extraordinary sacrifice in leaving the splendid home of her wealthy parent to join her fate with his modest and inconsiderable, not to say dubious, future. He was at that time in business upon his own account, and he entertained no doubt that he was abundantly able to marry. But he soon found that, from some unknown cause, trade was not so promising as it had been. And then he observed a disposition on the part of his creditors, within 12 months from the day of his nuptials, to shun him when he sought new accommodations or an increase of facilities. The secret poison of his vengeful and determined father-in-law was silently at work, but Elsa knew nothing, suspected nothing of this. That is autobiographical. That means that Joseph Poyen tried to ruin Matthew's credit, and he didn't realize why he was having so much trouble. There's other passages in this book that talk about, the troubles that they had, and the drinking and the so forth and so on, as this business failed. But I don't think I'll go into that. I marked them off, but I don't think I'll go into it. I just want to establish that one thing. Now, there's one, that was a detail that I remembered way before I had any evidence for it. But there was another one, and that is that Abby's father threatened to send her to a finishing school, probably in Paris somewhere, to completely separate them, and that Abby was terrified of it because it would have crushed her. Independent-minded young women were crushed at these places. There's one account, it might have been a friend of Abby's, but there's an account of a girl that was sent to one of these schools, and she was rebellious, and they forced her to scrub the marble steps on her hands and knees, and she came home a cripple. She was crippled the rest of her life from that, see. So that's what some of these schools were like. Beautiful on the outside and cruel on the inside, see. So my memory has told me over and over and over that her father threatened to send her to one of these schools. So we don't have evidence for that yet, but it may show up someday. So now the first story is called Phrenology versus Cupid, again in the November 23 and November 30 editions, signed the last one with a double asterisk. Now in this story, there's two girls, and the two men are arguing as to which of the two girls are more desirable. And the one fellow, who's kind of a scientific mind, decides to test it because he believes in phrenology. The other one is a skeptic. Well, this is Matthew and Abby, because Abby believed in a number of esoteric teachings, and Matthew was the skeptic and would ridicule. So she's literally reproduced that part of at least their early relationship. Excuse me. Later on, Matthew came to accept the things that Abby taught and believed in and tried to teach him. But early on, he was skeptical and made fun of them. So she has reproduced that. She's drawn upon that. So she has these two friends, one of them skeptical, one of them believes in phrenology. The one that believes that they kind of have a bet, not for money, but they have a kind of a bet as to, will phrenology play out or not? And the skeptical friend wants him to meet this beautiful, talented, accomplished young woman. Well, turns out that they also belong to a charitable organization, a charity club. This was drawn from Abby's life because she would do poor visiting, which is something I remembered way, way back at the beginning before I had hardly any evidence for it. So she did poor visiting. She belonged to this organization. And there was two girls in there. One of them was Lucretia, the talented, beautiful one. And then there was a girl that was described as being like a little Quakeress who was sincere and much more devoted to the charity cause when nobody was looking and nobody was impressed by it, see, but was a little plainer, and less ostentatious. So the question was, which of these two girls would be the better choice for marriage? Well, there was like Abby was in both of them in a sense. There was elements of Abby in both because Abby was beautiful and she was extremely talented and could play piano and sing beautifully and so on. So she actually had that side of her personality, but she also had this side. Mary was the girl's name, the little Quakeress. She's not literally a Quakeress. And years earlier, Abby had written a story, maybe one of her first stories, about Mary of the Valley, who was a very humble young woman of excellent character. See, it was clearly autobiographical for her. And then she'd written about another Mary. So, it was like these are both her. But the fellow that believes in phrenology finds bumps on the skull of the talented one, Lucretia, that are kind of foreboding. And the skeptical guy just dismisses it, but it turns out to be right because in the charity group, it's a long story, it's hard to explain, but basically little Mary Manning, the Quakeress, is not there, wasn't available to go out poor visiting, so Lucretia did it. And when she got back, she reported on this woman, a widow that had children, and she was struggling, and when the men came in, she really ramped it up and gave a very theatrical sales pitch, basically, to try to donate to this woman, only for it to turn out that this woman refused charity, and Mary Manning knew she would refuse charity in the first place and had recommended against it. So everybody could see that she put on this big show for the men, see? And that totally destroyed her reputation with them, So it's a little bit, this is kind of women of the 19th century. I think they didn't have lives outside the home, or their own social circles. So their social circles became hugely important, and I think that's what this reflects. It's high drama, in other words, for Victorian women. But anyway, the gist of it is that this fellow kind of backed away from Lucretia, seeing this side of her. And the way it was left was that he might, if Mary Manning liked him, he might be interested in Mary Manning instead, and it was kind of left there. But the person that believed in phrenology won the argument, which was Abby. So that's fine. But then we get into this second one. This second one tore my heart out, really. I think it was, first off, I think that Abby wrote these for extra money. Now, the earlier stories that she had written that Matthew published for her posthumously in 1849, 1850, have a lot of the occult and metaphysics and the paranormal in them. They're also deeply religious. And all of that is pretty much missing. We just have phrenology brought in as a kind of a humorous subplot, but it's not really central to the story. Even though it's titled Phrenology versus Cupid, it's really not central. It's really about who should you choose to marry and on what basis. And, the one that doesn't look like the flashiest, most attractive partner may be the best spouse in the future. See, that's the gist of it. Well, the second one is ostensibly about the same thing. I think she wrote these things to bring extra cash in. And she went very light on the metaphysics and very light on the paranormal. It's still there. And she also, I was going to say that charity, social reform was big in the ones that she wrote before. She backed off of that too. She still has the charity circle, and the poor visiting, but it's kind of peripheral to the subject, which is really relationships, because she knew that's what really appealed to people was relationships. So this one, whereas the first one she had talked about women. This one, she talks about men. Which should a girl choose for a husband, for a future husband? Is it the flashy one, the one that has money and is fun and the life of the social circle, life of the party and all that kind of thing, who is, raised with money and has money? Or is it one that might not be initially so desirable? In this case, it's an older man named Mr. Barnard, who is kind of proper. He's very nice. He's ethical and responsible and interesting conversationalist and so on. But he's like way too old for this girl, Belinda, to really seriously consider. But then she finds that she misses him. He spends some time away and she misses him. And then he shows back up and she ends up marrying him. And they're happily married ever after, see? Well, the other girl, Louisa, she is in love with a Charles Sedgwick, a lawyer who was raised by a rich uncle. He's spoiled. He has really no work ethic, and they come to ruin. Well, but the way they come to ruin reflects, I would say, Abby's circumstances far too closely to be a coincidence. So I think the story wasn't originally intended to represent Matthew. Matter of fact, it's opposite Matthew, because Matthew came from a poor family. He had a very strong work ethic, and so on. But as it ends up, it starts to get kind of similar to what was going on in her personal life. And that's where it just tore my heart out, because it looks as though she was secretly considering leaving Matthew at this time, at this late time. So it talks about Charles has kind of abandoned her. It doesn't say he's drinking, but the inference is that he might be. And she's impoverished. She's being kicked out of her apartment, and her friends or her sisters kind of find a place for her. And, she's starving to death. And her father had, in fact, apparently said that he would never help her unless she left Charles. And the sisters arrange for her to meet with her father without telling anybody. And I'm going to read a little bit of that. See, this is a little bit long, and we're really pushing the time, but I think this is pretty interesting. But the angry tones of his voice, this is the father when he realized that she was there, reached the painfully quickened ear of his daughter as she lay on the sofa in her apartment. Quick as thought, notwithstanding her weakness, she rushed into the room and, planting herself between him and the door, with outstretched arms exclaimed, "Oh, my father, forgive!" And utterly exhausted, she would have fallen on the floor had he not caught her. For a moment, pride still triumphed, but the father's heart could not resist the pleadings of that wan, haggard face. He clasped her to his bosom, and they mingled their tears together. Oh, it is a fearful thing to see the strong and proud man weep, to see his rugged frame bend and shake like a feeble woman's before the storm of grief. It would be vain to attempt a description of the scene. When he recovered his voice, he said, "My poor Louisa, how is this? How came you here?" She raised her head feebly from his bosom, and looking at Mrs. Barnard, which is Belinda, said, "She brought me here, her sister, and to her I owe this meeting. She is an angel, but this must not be. You must go home. You are sick. Your mother will be your best nurse." Well, this is also autobiographical because Abby's mother, Sally, was a healer. Louisa was indeed taken back to the home and hearts of her parents. They felt that though she had committed one great error, it was a generous one and had been bitterly atoned. See, this just, her father, whose heart had long been the prey of remorse and uneasiness, which was not really true with Joseph Poyen, I think, now looked happier than he had done for years. The meek, uncomplaining fortitude and Christian resignation of the sufferer, which is to say Louisa, endeared her more than ever to all her friends. Yet it was too late for the most ardent love and the tenderest attentions to win back the tide of life into her veins. See, Abby knows she's dying of consumption. Decay was busy at her heartstrings, and before the spring burst forth into beauty, which was true for Abby, actually, this is prescient, she was laid in the family tomb on one of the lovely hillsides of Mount Auburn, fit resting place for one so fair and good. Mr. Morley, who seldom did anything by halves, procured a situation for her husband on board a ship going out to India, but he never returned, having died at Calcutta soon after his arrival. The bereaved parents were in time comforted for the loss of their daughter by the love and care of her little Charles and Louisa, the children. Again, Abby drew from real life and didn't really paint real life and then distort it the way Matthew did. But still, it's pretty obvious that she imagines her father to be a much better person than he really was, to have feelings he didn't actually have. And she's being swayed, apparently, to see Matthew as, somebody who was just letting the business go and abandoning her and neglecting her, when actually he was doing everything he possibly could to try to make this failing business succeed enough to support them. He was desperate to try to save her, but apparently she was not really quite in her right mind. She'd received what she thought was probably a death sentence of consumption, and she began to listen to whoever it was that was trying to make her see this the other way. In the midst of all this, we have quite a number of things confirmed, that they did in fact elope, that her father did in fact cut her off, and then everything that Matthew portrays in The Rag Picker, which he bitterly repented of, to the extent that he, really did something wrong, which I think he was drinking, and probably he either wasn't taking the situation as seriously as he needed to or looked like he wasn't. At any rate, he suffered from terrible guilt, and I have other evidence for that. Now, there's one thing I missed that I want to wrap up with, and that is going back to Albert Pike. It's not just me, apparently, who has found evidence that he fled Massachusetts for less than honorable reasons, because I found a website. This is through the Smithsonian. It's civilwarstudies.org, the Smithsonian Associates. This is the Smithsonian Associates Civil War email newsletter, Volume 5, Number 1. You can find it online. It's titled Albert Pike, Hero or Scoundrel. And I'll read a little bit of this. Carved at the base of Albert Pike's statue at 3rd and D Streets in Northwest Washington are the words, philosopher, jurist, orator, author, poet, scholar, soldier. Now, he was not a poet. He stole Abby Poyen's poetry and got a reputation for being a poet. And he was a terrible plagiarist, so he really was not an author either. Some of his contemporaries could accurately add libertine, traitor, glutton, incompetent, murderer. If he was those things, he could not have written the deeply spiritual, ethereal, feminine poetry that he claimed. It's impossible. You can't get good fruit, meaning deeply spiritual fruit, from bad trees. You can get knockoffs, you can get imitations, but if you see authentically spiritual work supposedly coming from a man like that, he plagiarized it. Now, continuing here, born in Massachusetts, Pike was 6 feet tall. He was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts, right near Matthew's town of Haverhill. Pike was 6 feet tall and weighed 300 pounds. Matthew was 6 feet 2 and weighed less than that. An imposing image even without his waist-length hair. He claimed he attended Harvard, but no record of it exists. I don't know if he claimed it. Later on, he said that he never went because he couldn't afford to, even though he was accepted. So there's some weird wishy-washiness there. He made up for any lack of verifiable formal education with a self-taught curriculum in the classics and poetry, and he could converse in Sanskrit, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and French. Well, this guy's a compulsive liar, so I would take all that with a grain of salt. With this training, he became a school teacher, but by 1831, he left for the wilds of the West. Now listen to this. After rumors of affairs made it impossible for him to remain in Massachusetts. Now that's the first I found any inkling of that other than in my own research. I looked on that website. There's a place for an email, but they've removed the email. But there's the phone numbers. I called the phone number. It was the main phone number for the Smithsonian. And I managed to get the email address to write to, and I wrote an email address asking for information on this. Now, I doubt that I'll hear from anybody, but I'm trying to trace that down. What did they base that on? See? So somewhere buried in the history, there were critics of Albert Pike who say that there were rumors of affairs, and that's why he left Massachusetts. Well, that's what Matthew was writing about in No Ear for Music, and the earlier one about Jonathan Jenks. And so I could continue, but I think that's enough. I'm well over my usual hour mark. So I don't know who will watch this now. I think it will be of more interest in the future when people realize that all of this is correct, that I'm not pulling any of this out of the air, that this is careful research, and that I'm right about all of this stuff, essentially. Occasionally I'll be mistaken. Like when I was looking in the Portland Transcript, I knew that Matthew would sign as P, that he used variations on Peter Pumpkin. So there was a Peter Pickle in there. And I said, no, I don't think this is him. It didn't look like him, and it went too far back, into 1824. And likewise, there was a signature P that even did a travelogue of travel around Maine, and it looked a lot like some of the things and poetry and so on. But that went way back. Plus, there were some things that didn't look like they were Matthew. Matthew had not traveled extensively in Maine, I don't think, at that time, as far as I know. So I discounted that as Matthew's, and so all of the pictures of pieces signed P, I had to just forget about them, So wasted effort. So occasionally I'm wrong, but essentially in the main, I'm right about all of this material. So in the future, people will figure that out. And when they really get that epiphany, this is going to be a lot more interesting to them.